Rain hammered against the cracked windows of the detention facility like bullets from heaven, each drop carrying the weight of another sleepless night in this God-forsaken place. Maya pressed her back against the cold concrete wall, feeling the familiar ache in her shoulder where the old injury never quite healed properly. 3 months. 3 months since they'd dragged her from her apartment in the dead of night, blindfolded and zip-tied, thrown into the back of an unmarked van like she was nothing more than cargo. 3 months since her world had collapsed into this 8x10 cell that smelled of disinfectant and despair. She traced her fingers along the small tattoo on her left wrist, a habit that had become as natural as breathing since her capture. It was nothing special, really, just a simple constellation of 7 tiny stars arranged in a pattern that looked almost random to the untrained eye. She'd gotten it on her 21st birthday, drunk on cheap wine and cheaper rebellion, in some hole-in-the-wall parlor in Brooklyn where the needle buzzed like an angry wasp and the artist's hands shook from too much caffeine or maybe something stronger. Her friends had all gotten matching tattoos that night, butterflies and infinity symbols and inspirational quotes in cursive script. But Maya had always been different, always been drawn to things that others couldn't quite understand. "It's just stars," she'd told the artist when he'd asked about the meaning. "No story, no symbolism, just stars." And that had been the truth, or at least what she'd believed to be the truth at the time. The pattern had come to her in a dream, vivid and insistent, 7 points of light burning against the darkness of her sleeping mind. She'd drawn it on a napkin the next morning, the image as clear as if someone had branded it onto her memory with fire. Now, sitting in this cell with nothing but time and the echo of her own breathing for company, she wondered if perhaps there had been more to it than she'd realized. The tattoo seemed to pulse with its own warmth sometimes, especially in the quiet hours before dawn when the world felt thin and fragile, as if reality itself might crack open like an eggshell to reveal whatever lay beneath. The other prisoners rarely spoke to her. She'd learned early on that in places like this, silence was survival, and curiosity was a luxury that could get you killed. But she'd caught them staring sometimes, their eyes drawn inexplicably to her wrist, their faces clouded with expressions she couldn't quite read. Fear, maybe, or recognition. One woman, an elderly academic who'd been imprisoned for teaching unauthorized history, had approached her during their brief exercise period 2 weeks ago. She'd grabbed Maya's wrist with surprising strength, her weathered fingers tracing the constellation with reverent care. "Where did you get this?" the woman had whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of boots on concrete as the guards patrolled their perimeter. "It's nothing," Maya had replied automatically, the same words she'd been saying for years. "Just a tattoo I got when I was young and stupid." But the woman had shaken her head, her pale eyes bright with something that might have been hope or terror. "This isn't nothing, child. This is everything. This is—" The sharp blast of a whistle had cut her off as the guards signaled the end of exercise time, and Maya had been hustled back to her cell before she could hear the rest of whatever the woman had been trying to tell her. That night, she'd lain awake staring at the 7 stars on her wrist, wondering what secret they might be hiding. She'd Googled the pattern once, years ago, out of idle curiosity. It didn't match any known constellation, didn't correspond to any significant arrangement of stars in the night sky that she could find. It was just 7 dots, connected by invisible lines that existed only in her imagination. 7 stars that had haunted her dreams for one night when she was 20 and now seemed to haunt her waking hours in ways she couldn't begin to understand. The sound of approaching footsteps jerked her from her reverie. Heavy boots on concrete, the jangle of keys, the whisper of fabric against fabric. Maya had learned to read the subtle variations in these sounds like a musician reading sheet music. These weren't the lazy, shuffling steps of the regular guards making their hourly rounds. These were purposeful, urgent, carrying with them the weight of authority and the promise of change. Her cell door opened with a screech of protest from hinges that hadn't seen oil in longer than she cared to think about. 2 guards flanked the doorway, their faces hidden behind the standard-issue masks that all facility personnel wore. Between them stood a figure she'd never seen before. Tall, lean, dressed in the dark blue uniform of the upper command structure. Stars glittered on his collar, real ones this time, not the imaginary constellation that decorated her skin. Prisoner. 77401, the commander said, his voice carrying the clipped precision of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. You're to come with me. Maya didn't move from her position against the wall. In her 3 months here, she'd learned that sudden changes in routine were rarely good news. Prisoners who were taken away in the middle of the night sometimes came back different, hollow-eyed and speaking in whispers about things they couldn't quite remember. Sometimes they didn't come back at all. Where? She asked, proud that her voice came out steady despite the fear that was crawling up her spine like ice. The commander stepped into the cell, and for the first time Maya got a clear look at his face. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe mid-40s, with steel-gray hair and eyes the color of winter storms. There was something familiar about him, something that nagged at the edges of her memory like a half-remembered dream. But it was his expression that made her blood run cold. Not the brutal indifference she'd grown accustomed to from the guards, but something far more dangerous. Recognition. Wonder. And underneath it all, a fear so profound it seemed to radiate from him, like heat from a fever. His gaze found her wrist, and Maya watched as his face went pale as old bone. His lips moved soundlessly as if he were trying to speak but had forgotten how to form words. One trembling hand reached toward her, fingers outstretched before he seemed to catch himself and let it fall back to his side. "My God," he whispered, the words so quiet she almost missed them. "It's real. After all these years, it's real." The silence that followed stretched between them like a taut wire, vibrating with unspoken truths and questions that Maya wasn't sure she wanted answered. The commander, his nameplate read Kellerman, seemed to be fighting some internal battle, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides as if he were trying to decide whether to salute her or shoot her. The guards flanking the doorway shifted, uncomfortably, clearly sensing the strange electricity in the air but not understanding its source. "Sir?" one of them ventured, his voice muffled by the standard-issue mask. "Should we escort the prisoner to interrogation room 7 as planned?" Kellerman's head snapped toward the guard with such sudden violence that the man actually took a step backward. "No," the commander said, his voice low and dangerous. "Change of plans. Take her to my private office. No stops, no detours, and nobody, absolutely nobody, is to know about this transfer. Is that understood?" The guards nodded quickly, but Maya caught the look they exchanged. Confusion mixed with the kind of professional wariness that came from years of following orders they didn't understand. She'd seen that look before, in the eyes of soldiers who were being asked to cross lines they weren't sure existed. As they escorted her through the labyrinthine corridors of the facility, Maya tried to make sense of what was happening. The commander walked ahead of them, his posture rigid with barely controlled tension. Every few steps he would glance back at her wrist, his eyes lingering on the small constellation before jerking away as if the sight burned him. The guards flanked her like a military procession, their boots echoing in perfect synchronization against the polished floors of what was clearly an administrative section of the building, a part she'd never seen before. The walls here were different from the stark concrete of the detention blocks. These were painted a sterile white and lined with framed photographs that Maya recognized as military commendations and group shots of uniformed officers. But it was the portraits that made her skin crawl, row after row of black and white photographs, showing men and women in uniform, their eyes following her progress down the hallway with the unblinking intensity of the dead. Kellerman's office was a study in controlled chaos. Maps covered every available wall surface, marked with colored pins and string that created patterns Maya couldn't decipher. File cabinets lined the room like silent sentinels, their metal surfaces scarred with the wear of constant use. But it was the desk that dominated the space, a massive oak monstrosity that looked like it had survived at least 2 wars and possibly a revolution. Its surface was covered with documents, photographs, and what appeared to be astronomical charts dotted, with handwritten notes in several different languages. "Sir," one of the guards began, but Kellerman cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Leave us," he commanded. "Wait outside and make sure we're not disturbed. If anyone asks, I'm conducting a routine security briefing. Nothing more." The guards hesitated for a moment. Clearly, this wasn't standard protocol, but ultimately filed out, closing the heavy door behind them with a soft click that somehow sounded final. Maya found herself alone with the commander, acutely aware of the weight of his gaze and the strange sense that her entire world was about to shift on its axis. Kellerman moved to his desk and began rifling through the papers with frantic energy, muttering under his breath in what sounded like a mixture of English and something else. Russian, maybe, or possibly German. Maya couldn't be sure. When he found what he was looking for, he held up a photograph with shaking hands. "Sit down," he said, gesturing toward a chair positioned across from his desk. It wasn't a request. Maya remained standing. "I'd rather not." For a moment, she thought he might force the issue, but instead he nodded as if her defiance somehow confirmed something he'd been thinking. "Of course, you wouldn't. Not after everything we've put you through." He set the photograph face down on the desk and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Do you know why you're here, Maya?" The sound of her name on his lips sent a chill down her spine. They'd been calling her by her prisoner number for 3 months, 7041, as if her identity was something that could be stripped away along with her freedom. Hearing her actual name in this sterile office felt like a violation somehow, intimate and wrong. "Because you people kidnapped me from my apartment and dragged me to this hellhole," she replied, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "Because you've kept me locked up for 3 months without charges, without a lawyer, without even telling me what I'm supposed to have done wrong." Kellerman's laugh was bitter, devoid of any humor. "What you've done wrong?" He flipped the photograph over and slid it across the desk toward her. "Look at this and tell me you don't know what you've done wrong." Maya approached the desk reluctantly, every instinct screaming at her to run even though there was nowhere to go. The photograph was old, decades old, judging by the sepia tone and the quality of the paper. It showed a group of 7 people, standing in what appeared to be some kind of laboratory or research facility. They were all wearing white coats, and their expressions ranged from excitement to barely concealed terror. But it was the woman in the center of the group that made Maya's breath catch in her throat. She had Maya's face, Maya's eyes, Maya's dark hair pulled back in the same messy bun that Maya favored when she was concentrating on something difficult. The resemblance was so perfect it was like looking into a mirror, if mirrors could show you images from 50 years in the past. "That's impossible," Maya whispered, sinking into the chair without realizing she was doing it. "This is some kind of trick, photo manipulation, or—" Her name was Elena Vasquez, Kellerman interrupted, his voice soft now, almost gentle. "She was a theoretical physicist working on Project Stellaris in 1973. Brilliant woman. Revolutionary theories about quantum entanglement and parallel dimensional structures. She disappeared one night from her laboratory along with 6 other researchers and every trace of their work." Maya's hand moved unconsciously to her wrist, fingers tracing the familiar pattern of the 7 stars. "What does this have to do with me?" Kellerman reached into one of his desk drawers and pulled out a manila folder thick with documents. When he opened it, Maya caught a glimpse of photographs, official reports, and what looked like medical charts. "Elena Vasquez had a tattoo," he said, pulling out a close-up photograph that made Maya's blood turn to ice. 7 stars arranged in a specific pattern, a pattern that, according to her research notes, represented coordinates in what she called dimensional space, a kind of map to locations that existed outside our normal understanding of reality. The photograph showed a wrist bearing an identical, constellation to Maya's own. 7 stars in the exact same arrangement, down to the smallest detail. Maya stared at it until her eyes began to water, trying to find some difference, some proof that this was all an elaborate hoax. But there was none. The tattoos were identical. The night Elena disappeared, Kellerman continued, there was an incident at the laboratory. Witnesses reported strange lights, electromagnetic disturbances, and what one survivor described as a sound like reality tearing in half. When the military response team arrived, they found the building empty except for 7 bodies arranged in a perfect circle around some kind of experimental apparatus. The bodies were wrong, aged beyond recognition, as if they'd lived entire lifetimes in the span of a few hours. Maya's mouth felt dry as cotton. You're insane. This is all insane. People don't just disappear into other dimensions. That's science fiction bullshit, not— The tattoo appeared on your wrist when you were 21, Kellerman interrupted, and Maya's protest died in her throat. Not when you got it at that tattoo parlor in Brooklyn. We checked, by the way. The artist remembers you, remembers the pattern you insisted on, but he also remembers that when he finished the work, the tattoo looked different, older, as if it had been there for years instead of minutes. The room seemed to be spinning around Maya, reality tilting and shifting like water in a glass held by unsteady hands. She thought back to that night, to the warm buzz of alcohol in her veins, and the sting of the needle against her skin. She'd been so drunk, so caught up in the moment, that she hadn't really looked at the finished tattoo until the next morning, and when she had looked, it had seemed darker than she'd expected, more defined. The artist had done good work, she'd told herself, better than she'd hoped for from such a sketchy place. Elena's research suggested that consciousness could exist independently of linear time, Kellerman was saying, his words floating toward her through what felt like layers of cotton. That, under certain circumstances, memories and experiences could be transmitted across dimensional boundaries. Her final notes, the ones we recovered from her apartment, described dreams about a woman who looked exactly like her but lived in a different time, a different reality. Dreams so vivid that Elena began to believe she was somehow connected to this other version of herself. Maya's hand was pressed against her wrist now, covering the tattoo as if she could somehow make it disappear through sheer force of will. Stop! Just stop! This is impossible. People don't reincarnate or time travel or whatever sick fantasy you're trying to sell me. Kellerman leaned forward, his storm-gray eyes intense with a fervor that bordered on madness. 3 days ago, our satellites detected the same electromagnetic anomalies that preceded Elena's disappearance, the same frequency patterns, the same dimensional distortions. They're centered on this facility, Maya, on you. Whatever Elena started 50 years ago, whatever she opened or awakened or set in motion, it's happening again. The silence that followed was broken only by the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of rain against bulletproof glass. Maya stared at the photograph of Elena, at her own face looking back at her from across 5 decades, and felt something fundamental crack inside her chest. Not her heart. That was still beating with the frantic rhythm of panic and disbelief. Something deeper, something that had to do with the very nature of who she thought she was. "You're saying I'm her," she whispered, the words tasting like ashes in her mouth. "You're saying I'm some kind of reincarnation or clone, or I'm saying the universe is far stranger and more complex than most people can comprehend," Kellerman interrupted, rising from his chair and moving to one of the maps on the wall. This one showed the facility's layout, marked with red pins that formed a pattern Maya was beginning to recognize. 7 points, arranged in the exact configuration of her tattoo. Elena's research suggested that consciousness isn't bound by the linear progression of time the way we assume it is. That under certain circumstances, fragments of memory, personality, even soul, if you believe in such things, can persist across dimensional boundaries. Maya stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. This is insane. All of this. You kidnapped me, locked me up for months, and now you're feeding me some science fiction horror story about dimensional travel and past lives. I'm a freelance graphic designer from Queens, for Christ's sake. I make logos for small businesses and design wedding invitations. I'm nobody special. Elena said the same thing about herself, Kellerman replied, without turning around, right up until the night she managed to punch a hole through the fabric of reality itself. He traced one finger along the map, following the pattern of red pins. She was working on a theory about quantum consciousness, the idea that awareness itself might be a fundamental force of the universe, like gravity or electromagnetism. Her calculation suggested that consciousness could exist independently of physical matter, that it could theoretically travel between parallel versions of reality under the right conditions. And you believe this garbage? Maya's voice rose, with each word echoing off the sterile walls. You honestly think that 50 years ago, some physicist figured out how to hop between dimensions, and now I'm somehow the sequel? Kellerman finally turned to face her, and Maya was disturbed to see something that might have been compassion in his eyes. I didn't believe it, he admitted. Not until you showed up. Not until we started monitoring the anomalies and realized they were growing stronger every day. Not until we ran the facial recognition software and found that you match Elena's features with 97% accuracy, statistically impossible for two unrelated individuals. He returned to his desk and pulled out another folder, this one thicker than the first. When he opened it, Maya saw page after page of technical readouts, charts showing electromagnetic fluctuations, and photographs of equipment she couldn't identify. We've been tracking unusual energy signatures around the globe for decades, he continued. Always 7 focal points, always arranged in specific geometric patterns. The activity has been increasing exponentially since your 21st birthday, the day the tattoo appeared. The day I got the tattoo, Maya corrected, but even as she said it, doubt crept into her voice. The memory of that night was hazier than she liked to admit, blurred by alcohol and the strange, dreamlike quality that had surrounded the entire experience. The artist we interviewed said something interesting, Kellerman said, flipping through the pages until he found what he was looking for. He said you came in with a drawing of the pattern, but when he asked you where you'd gotten the design, you seemed confused. You told him it had come to you in a dream, but then you changed your story and said you'd found it in a book. Then you said you'd seen it somewhere online. 3 different explanations in the span of 10 minutes. Maya's hand moved to her wrist, again covering the tattoo as if she could somehow erase it through pressure alone. The memory of that conversation with the tattoo artist was coming back to her now, along with details she'd somehow managed to forget or suppress. The way he'd kept glancing at the drawing with an expression that might have been fear. The way the other customers in the shop had gradually fallen silent as he worked, their conversations dying away until the only sound was the buzz of the needle and the strangely rhythmic pattern of rain against the windows. There's something else, Kellerman said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Something we discovered when we started digging deeper into your background. He pulled out a birth certificate that looked official but somehow wrong, like a photograph that had been expertly retouched. You were born in Queens General Hospital on March 15, 1998. Except Queens General has no record of your birth. Your mother, according to this document, was Sarah Chen, but Sarah Chen died in a car accident 3 weeks before your supposed birth date. The words hit Maya like physical blows, each revelation making her step backward until she felt the wall against her spine. That's impossible. My mother is alive. She lives in Sacramento. We talk every Sunday. The woman you think is your mother is named Sarah Martinez, Kellerman replied, consulting another document. She's 62 years old, works as a high school mathematics teacher, and according to her medical records, she's never been pregnant, never even been married, despite the wedding ring she wears and the photographs of a husband who, according to our investigation, never existed. Maya's world tilted and spun, reality fracturing like glass under pressure. She thought of her mother, Sarah, with her warm smile and her tendency to hum while she cooked, with her stories about Maya's childhood and the photo albums full of memories that suddenly seemed too perfect, too carefully curated. You're lying. This is some kind of psychological warfare, some kind of... 3 days ago, we contacted Sarah Martinez and asked her about you. Kellerman continued relentlessly. She became extremely agitated and hung up. When our agents went to her house to follow up, they found it empty. Completely empty, as if no one had ever lived there at all. The neighbors told us they'd never seen anyone matching her description. The school where she supposedly worked had no record of employing anyone by that name. Maya slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor, her legs unable to support her any longer. The tattoo on her wrist felt hot now, pulsing with a warmth that seemed to spread up her arm and into her chest. This isn't real. None of this is real. The memories feel real because they were real, Kellerman said, his voice gentler now. But they weren't yours. Elena's research suggested that consciousness could imprint itself across dimensional boundaries, creating echoes of experience that could manifest in parallel versions of reality. We think you've been living Elena's memories of a life she never had, a life where she grew up normal, where she never became a physicist, where she never disappeared into whatever lies beyond our understanding of space and time. He knelt down beside her, and Maya was surprised to see genuine concern in his eyes. The question is, what do we do now? Because according to our calculations, the dimensional barriers are weakening. The same forces that took Elena and her team 50 years ago are building toward another cascade event, and this time, it's not going to be limited to one laboratory or 7 researchers. Maya looked up at him, tears streaming down her cheeks as everything she'd thought she knew about herself crumbled like ancient paper. What do you mean? Kellerman's expression was grim as he stood and moved back to the map on the wall. We think Elena's experiment created a kind of tear in reality, a wound that's been slowly healing itself over the past 5 decades. But healing is the wrong word. It's been growing, spreading, trying to balance itself across multiple dimensions. Your appearance, your tattoo, the electromagnetic anomalies. They're all signs that the process is reaching a critical point. Traced the pattern of red pins again, and Maya could see now that they corresponded not just to her tattoo, but to locations around the facility. If our models are correct, we have approximately 72 hours before the dimensional barriers collapse entirely. When that happens, the cascade effect won't be limited to 7 people in a laboratory. It could potentially affect millions of people across multiple parallel realities. Maya wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to process what he was telling her. And you think I'm the key to stopping it? Kellerman's laugh was bitter, and entirely without humor. No, Maya, I think you're the key that's going to unlock it. Elena's research notes suggest that the consciousness transfer process requires a willing participant, someone who can serve as an anchor point between dimensions, someone with the right genetic markers, the right psychological profile, and most importantly, the right tattoo. The implications of what he was saying hit Maya like ice water in her veins. You think Elena is still out there somewhere, in some other dimension, and she's been planning this for 50 years? You think she somehow created me to be her way back? I think Elena Vasquez was brilliant enough and desperate enough to find a way to cheat death itself, Kellerman replied. And I think she's been waiting a very long time for someone like you to open the door and let her come home. The words hung in the air between them like a death sentence, heavy with implications that Maya's mind refused to fully process. She pulled herself to her feet, using the wall for support, and walked to the window that looked out over the facility's courtyard. Through the reinforced glass, she could see other prisoners moving through their daily routines, exercise periods, work assignments, the endless shuffle of institutional life. But now she wondered how many of them were real. How many were like her, living borrowed memories and fabricated histories, unwittingly serving purposes they couldn't begin to understand. "Show me Elena's research notes," she said quietly, her breath fogging the glass. "If I'm supposed to be her way back into this reality, then I want to know what she planned. I want to know what happens to me when she comes home." Kellerman hesitated for a moment, then moved to a safe built into the wall behind his desk. The lock was biometric, requiring both his thumbprint and a retinal scan before it would open. Inside, Maya could see stacks of documents, photographs, and what appeared to be some kind of crystalline device that pulsed with its own internal light. "These are Elena's personal research notes," he said, pulling out a leather-bound journal. That looked far older than 50 years. The cover was worn smooth by countless hands, and when Maya touched it, she felt a shock of recognition so profound it made her gasp. She had held this journal before. She remembered the weight of it in her hands, the smell of old paper and ink, the way her fingers had traced the same patterns they were tracing now. But that was impossible. She had never seen this journal before in her life. "It's starting, isn't it?" Kellerman asked, watching her face carefully. "The memories are bleeding through. Elena wrote about this. She called it dimensional resonance. The closer the barriers get to collapse, the more her consciousness begins to merge with yours." Maya opened the journal with trembling hands and immediately understood why Kellerman had hesitated to show it to her. The handwriting was her own, not similar to hers, not reminiscent of hers, but identical in every curve and flourish. Page after page of equations and diagrams in handwriting so perfectly matched to her own that she might have written them yesterday, if she had understood any of the complex mathematics involved. "March 3rd, 1973, she read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. "The calculations are complete. The dimensional bridge is theoretically possible, but the energy requirements are staggering. More troubling, the process seems to require the kind of consciousness transfer that I'm not sure the human mind can survive. But time is running out. They're going to shut down the project next week, and this may be our only chance to prove that reality is far more malleable than anyone imagines." She flipped through more pages, her eyes catching fragments of text that made her blood run cold. References to anchoring consciousness across parallel timelines, creating stable resonance patterns through genetic manipulation, and ensuring the continuation of essential memory structures beyond physical death. "March 15th, 1973, she continued reading, her voice growing stronger as she began to understand the scope of Elena's plan. "I've identified the optimal timeline, a reality where I never became a physicist, where I lived a normal life free from the burden of this knowledge. The consciousness transfer will require perfect genetic compatibility, which means the anchor point will need to be, essentially, another version of myself. The process will create what I can only describe as a temporal loop. She will live my unlived life while I work to return to our shared origin point." Maya looked up at Kellerman, pieces of the puzzle finally beginning to form a coherent picture. She didn't just escape to another dimension. She created another version of herself, me, to serve as a way back. All those memories of growing, up in Queens, going to school, becoming a graphic designer, those were Elena's fantasies of the life she might have had if she hadn't become obsessed with interdimensional travel. "Keep reading," Kellerman said grimly. "It gets worse." Maya's eyes found the entry dated March 20th, 1973, the day before Elena's disappearance. "The process is almost complete, but I've realized something horrible. The consciousness transfer isn't temporary. When I return to the origin timeline, my anchor point, the other me, will cease to exist. Her memories, her experiences, her very sense of self will be consumed and integrated into my returning consciousness. She will have lived an entire life, believing she is real, only to discover at the moment of transfer that she was nothing more than a placeholder, a temporary vessel designed to maintain the dimensional bridge until my return. The journal slipped from Maya's nerveless fingers and hit the floor with a sound like thunder. She stared at Kellerman, understanding finally dawning with the terrible clarity of a nightmare becoming real. "I'm not real," she whispered. "I'm just an echo, a shadow of someone else's unlived life, and when Elena comes back, when the dimensional barriers collapse, I'll just stop existing." "Maya," Kellerman started, but she cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Don't." Her voice was steady now, filled with a calm that surprised them both. "Don't tell me it's not true. Don't tell me I'm real, or that my feelings matter, or any of that bullshit. I can feel her in my head now, Elena. I can feel her memories starting to surface, her knowledge bleeding through. She's brilliant, isn't she? Brilliant enough to create an entire false reality, complete with fake mothers and fabricated childhoods and tattoos that appear in dreams." She picked up the journal and continued reading, her voice taking on a clinical detachment that made Kellerman flinch. "March 21st, 1973. Tomorrow we activate the dimensional bridge. If my calculations are correct, I will spend the next 50 years in a parallel reality, perfecting the technology needed to create a stable return pathway. My anchor point will live those same 50 years believing she is the real Elena Vasquez, never knowing that her entire existence is built on borrowed time and borrowed memories." Maya closed the journal and looked directly at Kellerman. "But Elena made one mistake in her calculations, didn't she? She assumed that her anchor point would be passive, would never discover the truth, would never have the chance to make her own choice about whether to sacrifice herself for someone else's return." Kellerman nodded slowly. "The dimensional anomalies started 3 days ago because you're fighting back. Your consciousness is resisting the merger process, creating instabilities in the quantum field that Elena built around you. She didn't account for the possibility that you might develop your own sense of self strong enough to reject the integration." Maya walked back to the window and pressed her palm against the glass. In the distance, she could see storm clouds gathering, but she knew now that they weren't natural weather patterns. They were the visible manifestation of reality itself, beginning to buckle under the strain of maintaining two incompatible versions of the same consciousness. "So, what happens now?" she asked. "Do I let Elena come home and erase me from existence? Do I fight back and risk tearing a hole in reality that could destroy millions of people? Or is there a third option that nobody's thought of yet?" Kellerman joined her at the window, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked genuinely uncertain. "I don't know. Elena's research covers the mechanics of the consciousness transfer, but she never addressed the ethical implications of what she was planning. She saw you as a tool, a means to an end. She never considered that you might become a real person with your own desires and fears and right to exist." Maya smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Then I guess we're about to find out what happens when the tool decides to rewrite its own programming." As if in response to her words, the lights in the office flickered, and somewhere in the distance an alarm began to sound. Through the window, Maya could see the storm clouds spreading across the sky in patterns that defied meteorological explanation. 7 distinct formations arranged in the familiar constellation that had marked her from the beginning. "How long do we have?" she asked. Kellerman consulted his watch, his face pale in the intermittent light. "According to the latest readings, maybe 6 hours before the dimensional barriers collapse completely. After that, either Elena completes the transfer and you cease to exist, or the competing consciousness creates a feedback loop that tears apart the quantum foundation of local reality." Maya nodded, already formulating a plan that would have made Elena proud of her own ingenuity. "Then we'd better get to work, because I've just thought of a fourth option, one that Elena never considered because she was too arrogant to imagine that her own creation might outsmart her." She turned from the window, her eyes bright with a determination that was entirely her own, born not from borrowed memories or fabricated experiences, but from the desperate will to survive of someone who had just discovered that her entire existence was built on lies. Elena wanted to cheat death, Maya said, picking up the crystalline device from Kellerman's safe. It pulsed faster in her hands, responding to her touch with what almost seemed like recognition. But she never stopped to consider that maybe, just maybe, life might cheat her right back. Outside, the storm was growing stronger, and reality itself held its breath as two versions of the same consciousness prepared for a battle that would determine not just who would survive, but what the very nature of existence would become when the dust finally settled.